Laura Bradley, welcome to the Interviewist. Thank you for joining me. Laura is a award-winning features reporter and editor specializing in entertainment and culture reporting, and also content strategy now as well. She's had bylines in places like the Washington Post, Vulture, Vanity Fair, Slate, and the Daily Beast. She's even won a award in 2022 from the LA Press Club Art and Entertainment. Well, it's the Journalism Award for Best Celebrity Investigative Reporting for her exposé, Nicki Minaj and husband Kenneth Petty's campaign to silence his sexual assault victim. She's also conducted countless interviews with celebrities such as Mike Schur, Andy Garcia, Samantha Bee, Terry Crews, Daniel Radcliffe, and many other that you have definitely heard of. So, Laura, welcome to the Interviewist, and thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
All right, so I am very excited to talk to you because I think, especially those early in journalism, kind of talking to celebrities, doing the celebrity Q&A profile is kind of a much valued thing. And for you, you're like a pro at it by now. So I'm very intrigued to kind of just hear about how you've grown your interviewing skills over the years, especially I think when I think of tough interviews, I think of like celebrities and politicians. So we'll get into that. But first, just talk to me a little bit about your current involvement with interviewing. Like, in what capacity are you interviewing these days?
Yeah, I interview folks pretty much every week, both as a reporter and as someone who works in content marketing as well. In any given week, I might be talking to an actor or a director or a source for an investigative story, or on the completely other end, just like a subject matter expert about something that I'm working on a content marketing piece for. So I think each of these conversations is a bit of a gear switch because they demand different things, but it's really fun to flex that interviewing muscle in so many different ways.
Totally. Out of curiosity, just in our like post-COVID world, are you mostly on Zoom and Google Meets for interviews, or is it a mix?
Yeah, well, Zoom and phone. And I think with celebrity interviews, a lot of them were already by phone, or there would be what was called a press junket. So, like a movie is coming out or a TV show is coming out. A lot of the times you would get sort of like the floor of a hotel
Yes.
rented out, and every room would have a different person in it, and the journalists are kind of doing musical chairs between the rooms and interviewing folks. And that is the thing that primarily I have seen move to Zoom.
Hmm.
Because obviously during COVID, you could not have 100 people just wandering around the, 12th floor of a hotel, and just meeting different people. That would have been a nightmare for the CDC. So instead, they moved all of it to Zoom, and it has pretty much, I think, for junkets stayed there. I have been in very few in-person junkets since COVID. I would say that's the biggest change.
That's so
Ready
interesting.
to-
I
Yeah,
mean, does it give you more access to more celebrities though? No.
no, no, I wouldn't say so. I think, in fact, it can kind of be, I think it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's a little logistically easier to get, it's easier to do a Zoom junket from wherever you're working than it is to get downtown, especially if you had a screening or whatever. It's sometimes it's a little easier on that end, but I think it just gives you so much less information to not be in person at the end of the day. I think you get so much more visual context, body language. You get a lot more of that in person. And also, just anecdotally, it's easier to run over time when there's not a timer on the screen. It's much harder to eke a couple extra minutes out now than it was before.
Yeah, well, that's why it's so interesting. Sorry to be so tangential immediately that you say phone
I
for
love
so many too, because phone, like, I am not naturally like, yeah, let's hop on Zoom so you can see me in my house, but phone is almost the most mysterious interviewing format, I feel. So it's curious that you say you've got a lot of those. And I almost wonder, could that, like, is that a strategy in any way, do you think?
I mean, I think it can be a bit of an again, I feel like I'm going to end up using the words double-edged sword so much while we speak, but I think it's both, right? It can be a bit of an equalizer if you're a person. I pride myself on not being a particularly starstruck individual with a few very notable exceptions. But, I think for those who are prone to that, it can be a bit of an equalizer because you're not seeing a person in front of you. You're both just disembodied voices floating in the ether. That can be helpful. It's also interesting because when all you have to go on is the voice, you can get a lot of information just based on intonation, where are the pauses. On the flip side, obviously, much easier to accidentally talk over someone. And
Hmm.
I think when you're in a room, it's easier to, or when you're face to face via Zoom, even, it's easier to feel through a pause and decide whether this is a pause we should let hang for another 2 seconds, or whether this is a pause meaning, no, they really are done. And there's nothing you're going to get except more awkward silence if you don't say something. I think the game is a little easier to play when you're face to face than when you're on the phone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just imagining that Charlie Day meme where he's got all the rope and string and it's just trying to dissect the silence and which one it is.
Yeah, it's like that, except you're doing it over the course of split seconds because every second you add where no one is talking, particularly if it's for a shorter interview, you're like, oh man, I really can't waste too much of this. But again, you really don't want to cut someone off because often there's the pause and then they'll elaborate. And if you cut that part off, that's 9 times out of 10 the most interesting part of the answer is whenever they've gone through their initial thoughts and then realized how to sum it up more conversationally. Do not want to cut that off.
Yes, that's the kind of silence tip is always my favorite of just like muscling through your own cringe and being like, just wait. They're gonna
As
say it.
Especially as a person, I fully admit I am the person who is constantly trying to fill silences with my own voice or anything I can find. I think the most discipline you can have as an interviewer is to know when to just keep quiet.
Speaking of things to know as an interviewer, it's clear to me that you're very thoughtful and kind of detail oriented, it seems, when you're interviewing. So I'd love to know from your own perspective how you would describe your interviewing style or approach.
Think this is certainly not a novel technique I've pioneered. We all do this, but I would say more than anything, I try to make my interviews feel conversational. And depending on the context, that really means different things.
Hmm.
For instance, if I'm speaking to an actor or a director, that means I'm talking to someone who has probably answered all of the basic questions so many times that the minute they hear it, their brain just shuts down, as anybody's would, and you go into sort of a script.
Hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of people work really hard not to do that. This is not, me bashing any subject of an
Totally.
interview, but it's just when you've been asked the same question 100 times, you're naturally going to have a few things that you just keep repeating. And
Totally.
so I think you can feel, and CEOs will do that, politicians, anybody who speaks for a living has a sort of script. And so I think you can feel when someone is lapsing into that. And so whenever I hear that happening, I try to really focus on asking an unexpected question, maybe not in an impertinent way, but maybe it's just something that
Mhm.
I won't even use, but just like a follow-up or anything that'll kind of get us into a place where I feel like, okay, they haven't talked about this a million times. It's going to get us
Mhm.
both re-engaged a little bit. Um, or introduce a new idea, just anything to get us away from subject they've covered 1,000 times. So that's for sort of a person who does a lot of interviews, the way you make it conversational. I think with investigative sources, it's sort of the opposite, right?
Mhm.
Often these are folks who haven't ever given an interview or, not very many. And so I think that is a lot more empowering folks to really feel safe and really earning trust, building trust by sort of letting them perhaps have a little bit more leeway in determining the parameters of the interview than you would with someone else. I'll often offer to talk off the record first,
Mhm.
just so that nothing you say is going to sort of be used against you. You're not tied up into anything you don't want to be involved in.
Totally.
In those cases, it's really about, okay, you have something to say. I don't want us both kind of walking on eggshells around each other while we figure out what that looks like. I would rather you just know that you can trust me to not turn around and print whatever you say 2 days later without your consent. And so then with subject matter experts, again, that's a completely different ballgame. I think a conversational interview there really comes from showing you're both prepared enough in the material to talk to them fluently about it, but then
Hmm.
also making sure that whenever they lapse into their own script, which tends to be sort of jargon, or, if you're talking to a scientist, they'll start speaking in ways that perhaps the reader is not necessarily
Yeah.
either going to follow or want to follow.
Yes.
You kind of, those follow-ups are just to try to get it more conversational. So sometimes I'll just play the dummy and be like, I'm sorry, can you just like explain that? I don't think I get it. And sometimes I do get it, but I think it can just sometimes help to guide the tone of those conversations. So, I mean, really, most of my interviews are for text-based work. So I think
Hmm.
at the end of the day, no matter who's in front of me, the main thing to me is just listening and trying to feel out how those words are going to hit the reader when they're on a page. Is it going to feel like I'm reading a conversation, or is it going to feel like I'm reading a textbook or someone's PR speech or whatever it is?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's so interesting your point of how, as text-based, thinking about how it will come across on the page, because I think as anyone who's received like a no punctuation email or text has gotten, it can be misinterpreted in so many different ways. It strikes me that kind of your style throughout all is a little bit like establishing trust really quickly, like being prepared for subject matter interviews, basically like what you're talking about, establishing trust that you're not going to just print wild things that a more vulnerable interviewee has said, and like with directors and whatnot, being able to like get them out of their speaking rut or whatever. Do you feel that's accurate? And also kind of like how much preparation do you put into interviews to be able to do this?
I'd say that's pretty accurate. And again, I hesitate to label it a rut only because I do think it tends to be caused, like it's a failure on our end when people get into that rut, because it means that that many reporters before have just asked the same question over and over. And, I've done it. We've all done it. You didn't have time to kind of do the extra leg of research. But to answer your question, yeah, I try to do as much research as I can. I'll try to read anywhere, any interview you've given before. When I'm talking to you, I try to have read, I mean, unless you're somebody who, has been giving interviews for 80 years and I will never read all of them. But I mean,
Yeah.
on any given subject, I try to really read up. I try to look for follow-ups that didn't get asked in those interviews, because I think that can be a way to reference what's come before in a way that's not redundant. I try to get a mix of sort of professional and personal, if that's appropriate. If we're doing more of a personality guided piece, I'm trying to see not just how have you talked about your work, but
Mhm.
how much do you talk about your life? How do you talk about your life? What seem to be the places that you feel comfortable talking versus not comfortable? Are they places that you should be prodded to talk more about, or are they things that it would just be more sensitive to leave alone? All of that. But I think as an interviewer, the best thing you can do for yourself is to do as much research as possible, because even if it doesn't turn into a question you ask, it can inform how you handle curveballs in the interview. And it can also tell you a lot about how the subject you are interviewing interacts with being interviewed. There are some folks who are very open books. They love to talk, they love to give an interview. There are some folks who really love to play with the interviewer and like, mix it up a little bit. And I think it feels very different if you're in an interview and someone starts just challenging you professionally, but just being a little more,
Hmm.
um, I don't know what the even word would be, but a little spicier. And there are some
Yeah.
folks who just are spicier. And if you know that going in, you're not going to take it personally. You're just going to know this is what it looks like. But if
Mhm.
you're somebody who hasn't done that research, and now you've got somebody mixing it up with you a little bit, you can be like, did I say something? It'll get you in your
Right.
head.
Can you talk about kind of those challenging interview moments a bit more? And this kind of leads into the question I wanted to dive in with you most is, well, I'm in like B2B tech, so I'm talking to a lot of technical people, people who don't get interviewed very much. So they're always like, oh, someone wants to hear what I have to say. I'm gonna let all my thoughts go. But you work with a lot of people who are probably highly media trained, and I imagine kind of have been through the ropes of what to say, what not to say. But like you said, how do you kind of make sure when people are reading on the page that it still sounds like an authentic conversation and not just like some PR line? So, to sum up my question, how do you deal with these highly media trained individuals or these kind of more spicy people that you're interviewing?
I haven't interviewed too many spicy individuals. I've interviewed folks who kind of like to do a little intellectual sparring, like Bill Maher, but I mean, I think, I find those entertaining to a degree, just to be able to sort of just see if you can hold your own. Um, I think the media training thing is interesting because if you've been well media trained, it's pretty undetectable. I
Hmm.
think, think I don't know because I've not been to media training school, but I suspect that the main thing that you learn, or one of the main things you learn in media training school, is how to be so charming and make this interviewer think they are asking the best questions you've ever heard. And like if you were in another room, like if you were in another setting, you could be best friends. Like I don't know whether that's just a quality that a lot of celebrities naturally have, or whether that is sort of trained or a bit of both. But I think the main thing is to just kind of remember that you were there to do a job.
Mm.
And depending on what that job is, like just kind of staying on target. And I think, whether it's somebody who really knows how to be charming or somebody who really likes to just kind of play with the interview and make it sort of a fun game, whatever you're doing, it's just remembering what you came there, the answers that you came there to get, the questions you came there to ask, and staying focused on those. It can be
Totally.
very distracted and get in your head. So much of
Yeah.
it is getting in your head.
Yes. It's interviewing is a game with yourself sometimes as well.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a most memorable interview that you're willing to share with us?
Yeah, I would say it was for the investigative story you mentioned, looking into the allegations against Nicki Minaj and Kenneth Petty. I interviewed the primary source for that was a woman named Jennifer Huff, who had accused the couple of trying to pressure her through intermediaries into essentially recanting her allegations of sexual assault from the 1990s. He had been convicted of attempted rape when they were both teenagers. And we spoke for hours, multiple times, and I was really working to just kind of fully grasp the story. And that experience was really moving because I had such a clear sense of why I was doing what I was doing and why it mattered. I think it was really one of those moments that don't happen very often in real life where you just have that crystallizing, like, this is why I do what I do feeling. And I think it was the most memorable just because it really reminded me what I got into journalism for and how important it really can be. Uh, and on the completely other end of the spectrum, the first time I interviewed Daniel Radcliffe was very, very fun because I was terrified and he was very nice, which I had already heard from multiple people. He's nice, he's always nice, but I don't know. I was talking to Harry Potter and I was nervous, but he was, as promised, very kind and patient.
Yeah. But very different experiences, but both
That was the odd thing. Yeah.
definitely make sense as highly memorable. I had a few follow-up questions. I can't remember them now. Bad interviewer. But I guess for the former, did you feel like you said you were interviewing her for hours, multiple sessions? Did you feel like you're kind of interviewing changed at all over time? I guess I'm thinking like a question around stamina and being able to maintain trust with someone over kind of an extended time and having the patience. Like, how do you know when you've gotten what you need, I guess? This isn't a
That
clear question at all, but I think you get what I'm saying.
No, I mean, that's such a big question. I think, especially for investigations where the entire process runs the risk of being pretty re-traumatizing. There's so many variables with investigations, and I think doing them right is really difficult. I would say that I have. gotten more practice over time figuring out how to sort of structure my reporting process when it comes to investigations. I think I've learned what are the things we need to talk about up front, what are the things that, I can look into on my end to sort of find out if the allegation is this, what kind of corroboration are we going to need? Is it worth kind of diving into that? Are we going to be able to include it? If not, is it a road that we still want to go down anyway, just in case? I think what I have tried to do over time as I've done more investigative stories is really think about, does this conversation need to happen right now, or is it a conversation we can have further down the line? Just really trying to streamline the process so that the folks I'm talking to feel as though we're not just having conversations, but I'm kind of being conscientious of the process and how to make that minimally disruptive to them. I don't want folks to feel like I'm aimlessly wasting hours of their time that then
Hmm.
ends up not being used or whatever. And I wouldn't say that I did that in that case, but I think um I've gotten a little more deliberate just about how I structure the whole process. But I mean, it was the amount of conversation we were having was certainly necessary because in that case, it was just a very sort of long chronology going back to the 90s.
Hmm.
Um, and there were just sort of different beats that I had to sort of make sure I had in the right order and I understood who was involved in what. And, we're saying this happened. Do we have any corroboration for that? I can't just take your word for it. Like all of that, the usual reporting steps, and
Hmm.
I think depending on what you're doing, that can take some time. And so in that case, it just took some time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, to me too, it sounds like I really like your point about kind of being deliberate about when you're talking to someone to make sure it's like, I'm not just going to ask you like the hardest questions immediately or make it seem like crime porn or something. Like, I'm going to be strategic about how our conversations go. I think that's almost like a meta level of strategy with interviewing. But it seems to go back to like your whole building trust thing and like, you can trust me, I'm trying to do my job for you.
Yeah, and I mean it's difficult, I think, because I like that you use the term crime porn because there is such a sort of like, I think of it as trauma tourism. There can be such an impulse in all sorts of different journalism. And I don't think it's intentional or conscious or malicious, but there can just be the sort of it bleeds, it leads mentality, which I suppose has its place. But when I'm trying to do what I'm trying to do, I really try to focus on, I don't want readers to just read like, oh, here's this horrible thing that happened to this person and it has nothing to do with me.
Hmm.
Because I think that's where we get into the sort of exploitative potential, like the potential that we're being exploitative and just kind of like tromping around in someone's pain
Right.
without connecting it to anything larger. And so my impulse is often to ask about feelings, like how did you experience that?
Hmm.
How did that make you feel? How did it leave you? All of those types of questions. And I think they're both useful and can also be very painful to deal with, particularly if you then end up having to come back and say, well, we're actually not able to include that because we don't have the corroboration. So I typically try to get my arms around the whole story. But in terms of like digging in that next level into the emotional experience of it, that's where I've really tried to get a little more judicious of like, well, we know that, this is the allegation. Before we dig further into it, what corroboration do we have? Are we going to be able to include it? Because if not, then I have to ask myself that question of how much further into this do I want to dig? Is it
Hmm.
going to be helpful to anyone, or is it just kind of because I want to feel like I know everything? And I
Hmm.
mean, it's one thing to know everything, but if you can't, put it on the page, it just sometimes I think it's still worth knowing and worth digging into that just for context. But there are times I think where it's good to just sort of have that limitation in your mind so that it shapes how much you scratch at something.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like that has to be difficult too. As a journalist, you're naturally curious and like, I want to know everything.
Well,
So
and that's
that's
why I
fun.
say I think like the sort of bare bones like allegations portion, like
Hmm.
what are we saying, narratively happened. That part I try to know everything just because I think it should. It gives you necessary context. And sometimes the emotional context from one event can influence, it all depends, but I do think there have just been times where I've gone down a reporting road that was important, felt important, but I also then recognized that there were things we weren't able to include, and that can be really painful if you've really dug deep on it.
Yeah.
So really, even if we're going to have the conversation, I do try to kind of know to the degree that I can, because a lot of it can just be up in the air, but I try to know to the degree that I can and be able to sort of tell people like what things are looking like on my end. Because there is just naturally such a power imbalance with interviewing and with reporting that I think in a trauma context, you really have to think about that power imbalance because that's at the heart of so many of the things that we end up talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. This is all really interesting. Do you kind of feel like, especially when you have more vulnerable people that you're interviewing, you said earlier you might give them a little bit more leniency of, hey, we can talk about this off the record, etc. Are there any other kind of special approaches that you might take in this case with these kind of interviews? And this might be repetitive with what you've already talked about a bit.
I think the main thing that I do in these cases, because I think it's worth just kind of, like I said, remembering what you're going into an interview to do. Are you going there to speak to a powerful person and hold them to account, or are you going there to talk to somebody who has had their power taken away? And, we're not here to work as publicists. We're not here to sort of be advocates. That can be a very difficult thing to remember. But I think even putting aside the sort of impulse to be a publicist or an advocate for somebody, you can
Hmm.
still go in and just give them the professional courtesy of saying, hey, have you done an interview before? No. Okay, here's the process. Here are your options. We can talk on the record, which means this. We can talk on background, which means this. We can talk off the record, which means this. For this, and if someone feels comfortable talking off the record from the get, amazing, let's do it.
Hmm.
If it's a case where we want to have like a 20-minute introductory conversation off the record and then go from there, I'll do that. Really, it's just what I always tell people is like, I just want to be able to talk like people.
Right.
What is it going to take for you to feel safe to talk like a person? And what, you know, questions do you need answered from me before I start asking questions of you? Because most of these folks, like, they don't know me when I reach out.
Right.
They're not, they don't know my body of work. They don't know my approach. So different folks have different questions. Some folks want to see examples of what you've done. Some folks want to know about what the process is going to look like. But my goal up front is usually just to kind of say, like, okay, what do you need from me? And I'll do my best to kind of walk us both through this so that you understand what you are getting into and what you are not getting into.
Totally. Zooming out a little bit, do you have any other best practices, techniques, secret tips and tricks that you deploy when you're doing celebrity adjacent interviews?
I think I said it already, but the research part is really key because, like I said, these are folks who have been asked every mind-numbing question in the book 8,000 times.
Yeah.
So anything you can do to not be the next person to ask that question is great. So for me, that typically will be, like I said, reading through past interviews to see what they talk about a lot, what they don't, potential follow-ups from conversations that they might not have had time to get to. I'll try to come up with a few slightly left field questions that either I'll have them sort of interspersed through the interview or I'll just kind of have them in my back pocket in case, like I said, we start just feeling a little too scripted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those will typically be from research too, it'll just be sort of like oh, I see you did X, like, can we talk about that for a second? Or like just anything that gets us out of that sort of well-trod territory. And then I mentioned following up on interviews, like asking follow-up questions that could have been asked in other interviews, but
Yeah.
really the number one thing. is staying present and asking your own follow-up questions because
Hmm.
like so much of the time, again, you'll get to the end of an answer and you can either just move to the next question you scripted for yourself, or you can really stay with it for a second and dig one layer deeper. And that's where the interesting answer is, you know? So I
Hmm.
think it can be hard, especially when you're at a junket and it's like, well, you have 10 minutes. So do you want to ask that follow-up question? Is it going to be valuable? So I think to wrap it up, the most important thing you can do with any interview is to just go in with a plan. You
Hmm.
know, go in with a sense of purpose. Are we here to get a headline? Are we here to get the full story? Are we here to like show your personality? Whatever you're there to do, you should be able to like sum it up in a couple words and kind of just ask yourself, like at the 2 minute mark, at the 5 minute mark, you're like, okay, have I gotten the job part done? Can we dig a little deeper and just explore, play a little? Because that can be really fruitful. But
Hmm.
you want to make sure you've gotten the job done first.
Yeah. It's, I think for people outside of the interviewing space, it's like good interviewers make it look so easy. But especially when I have a hard interview, I just feel like afterwards I'm mentally exhausted because you're just thinking so hard the whole time about like, okay, do I follow up with this or do I just keep going? And also you're listening actively. So especially under your time constraints and junkets sounds exhausting and very difficult.
It's like both difficult and easier, right? Because I've only got 10 minutes to say something dumb. Like that's so much easier than having like 40 minutes to say something dumb. I feel often when I sign off from an interview a little bit like I do when I get home from a party, like I'm just thinking through everything that I said and I'm like, oh man, why didn't I ask that question? Or why did I think that was clever? That was so dumb. Like I have so many of those moments. And so in a way, with the junket, you just have to be so focused and on
Yeah.
task. Like, I really try to get the core of it done in the first half. I'm like, okay, did I get like, is there some kind of headline we can use? Fine. And that takes a bit of the pressure off. But
Yeah.
for sure, I mean, I think the great interviewers make it look easy. And I strive to one day make it look easy. I'm not convinced that I make it look easy at all, but I try to at least go in prepared.
At least fake it till you make it. One follow-up question I did have for you was on the idea of follow-ups. On the idea of follow-ups and kind of like those left field, left hand, I don't know, the other questions to kind of get people thinking, do you have like a set list of like, here are 5 questions that I can use in any scenario to get a more genuine answer out of people? Or are you really just super catering even those kind of questions per interview?
That would be so smart to just have a list. Maybe I should do that. No, it'll either be based on research or I think typically the left field stuff I'll do will be in the form of a follow-up. Sometimes I'll just like not crack a joke, but ask a slightly humorous question. Like if I find any opportunity for humor in an interview, I'm taking
Uh-huh.
it because I think that's one of the easiest ways to build rapport.
Hmm.
And that's why sometimes at the end of an interview, I'm like, man, why did I think that was clever? That was so stupid. Like sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think I typically just try to show engagement. Like if I want to reset an interview that feels like it's going a little off, I just try to establish either a sense that I've done the research, like with a subject matter expert, I'll suddenly just like slip in a question that like references the actual study that they did. Because if you've actually read the study, that surprises a depressing number of people. They're like, what do you mean? You read the study? You paid attention to the margin of error? Like, you're like, yes, I did. I think that can, show that you did your homework, you did your research on this person and their, what they do, or show engagement in the moment by being humorous, by asking a follow-up that shows you were really listening, just anything like that to kind of reestablish a connection when it feels like it's getting thin, I think is
Yeah,
really
I love it. I love I feel like maybe we have a similar interview style where we're both prone to what we think are funny jokes and asides to try and ease the ice. Does it work? Sometimes. All the
it,
time.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you have a win and sometimes you feel very embarrassed, but I think it's always worth trying.
It
As
is
long
worth
as your
trying.
humor appropriate, it's always worth trying.
I agree. So as we kind of wrap up, zooming out a little bit, thinking about the work that you're doing in the larger space of celebrity interview, you talked about earlier how you're very conscientious about how your interviews are consumed in a text format, but we've got magazine features, we've got celebrities on late show hosts, late shows. There's podcasts now that are blowing up. We've got all the like chicken-based interviews, like Chicken Shop Date, Hot Ones. Is there anything from your unique point of view that you would like to see more of with celebrity interviewing, or conversely, less of that you think's overdone?
I wouldn't say that there's sort of a really specific thing. Anecdotally, I mentioned a little earlier, I've noticed lately you'll see sort of one or a few outlets will get sort of the big splashy interview for when a movie's coming out. Like, the lead will do one to a few really splashy interviews with a couple publications. And then typically you'll see that a lot of other folks just got junket time. And I think that's always been the case, but it seems to be getting a little more so. Like, I just think I see fewer interviews being done in sort of a long
Interesting.
form
Hmm.
format, and those interviews are great, but I think it's always better to have more of them, more long conversations with journalists. And again, I get from a practical sense, it's like how many of these can somebody do? Is it worth it? I understand all that. But selfishly, I want as many long interviews as I can read.
Yeah.
Uh, and the other thing is just I would like to see a little bit more, maybe rigor. I find podcast interviews really fun, but the problem is the degree of fact checking that happens on those podcasts can really
Hmm.
vary. Some of them are wonderful, and some of them it's more just a free flowing conversation where folks can say whatever they want. And, I'm not saying that every interviewee out there has some sort of nefarious agenda that needs to be checked, but I just think in general, it's worth recognizing the value of each format and the limitation of each format,
Yeah.
depending on who you're talking to. And there's sort of just like this growing emphasis on celebrity interviews, which can be really fun. Like, I love Variety's Actors on Actors feature that comes out each award season. I think those can be really fun and illuminating for sure. At the same time, I think there's been a bit of pushback from journalists in this space of just being like, okay, like there's a time and a place for those, including Actors on Actors, great feature. Please
Hmm.
keep it alive forever. But, when we've sort of got actors interviewing each other for interview features a lot, again, you'll see a certain kind of question gets asked more than others. They're not
Hmm.
necessarily going to be as rigorous. And
Hmm.
you lose something. You lose something with that for sure.
Yeah. So all celebrities, please stay in your lane out there is the message that we're conveying. No,
Journalism jobs are disappearing enough. Don't take our job.
AI, celebrities, we cannot handle anymore. Um, Excellent. I think, let's see, what else do I want to pick your brain on? Do you have any more underrated interviewing tips? I know we've talked about a lot in this conversation.
I don't think I could possibly dispense more advice. I think,
That's fair. You've given us
I
some great, great tidbits.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably all the at least good advice I would have.
That's fair. Good. It's always good to know when to stop as well. A sign of a wise journalist. Last question then. Any interviewing muses, role models, inspirations that you kind of watch and on under or try and imitate in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, many. I've had a lot of really great just editors and mentors over the years. I think the person who stands out most in this moment, his name is Tim Tiemann. He's a journalist who I worked with at Daily Beast for a few years. He's just a very talented editor and interviewer in his own right. And he gave a talk about interviewing, I
Ooh.
think when I was a few weeks or maybe months into the job. And he talked a lot about just remembering how to hold on to, I guess you could say, your power as a journalist. I'm not sure the right way to frame it. He framed it a lot better than I will, but essentially the idea that, you go into an interview and someone might be there to tell you, oh, well, don't ask this thing, or well, stay away from this subject.
Hmm.
And uh, not in a way of being disrespectful or impertinent, but his advice was essentially, if you don't ask everything you've come there to ask, you're only doing a percentage of your job. And that's not, what anybody wants. If you're there as a journalist, you're there to get the story. And so you shouldn't let anybody really get in the way of that. As long as, again, you're not there to ask something just wildly inappropriate or whatever, you should feel comfortable pushing back on anyone who isn't your editor who is trying to limit your story.
Hmm.
I think as someone who I wouldn't say that I tend to immediately, cave to pressure or anything like that, but I can be somebody who wants to be, agreeable. I think, especially as women, we are very much taught, like, don't be argumentative, don't be combative, be
Hmm.
agreeable. So I think sometimes when I am faced with a request, my knee-jerk reaction is to be like, oh, should I back off this? Is it going to cause unnecessary trouble? And I think it's really good to just have that reminder, you are here to do a job, and no one would ask a surgeon or anyone else to only do 70% of their job, is essentially the way that he framed it so much better than I will, but that was
No, I
it.
love this. This is great. I think that's a great final tip of like, just remember you're doing your job. And it kind of goes back to that confidence thing of like, be confident in the job that you're doing and don't get in your head too much as possible. I love it. Any other gems you would like to shower on us?
I think I am gemless. I think that was every gem I have, but this has been really fun. So thank you for having me.
Yes, Laura, this has been great. So interesting. I loved hearing about your interviewing style and experience. So thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Of course, thank you.